I'd like to talk to you about classical ideas of war and see if we can connect them to the present crisis and see what we come up with, and we'll have some questions and answers. We had this idea in modern times that war is abnormal, or it's amoral, or it's rare. If we were to go back, though, to the beginning of Western culture and look what philosophers said about war, they felt that it was ubiquitous. It was, as Plato said, the natural order of things. Peace was a parenthesis, that's exact words, between the natural condition of war. Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, said, war is the father of all of us. And if you would go back to the 5th century and count the number of years at Athens, Socrates' city, Pericles' Acropolis, 2 out of every 3 years it was at war. If you look at wars throughout history, why is it that we have First and Second Peloponnesian Wars, First, Second, and Third Punic Wars, 30 Years' War, 100 Years' War, 7 Years' War, First Battle of Bull Run, Second Battle of Bull Run, First Battle of Coronea, Second Battle of Coronea. So war, whether we like it or not, seems to be endemic to the human species. In 1986, the United Nations tried to outlaw it and said that it's not natural to humans. And they outlawed it. They said it doesn't exist. But, of course, it does. And look at our last administration, who felt that they were going to have a new commitment to peace. Well, we intervened in Bosnia and Kosovo and Somalia. So even people who are adamantly opposed to war can't get away from it. So I'd like to talk about war in the classical sense and see if it makes sense to any of you, and we'll have some questions. What causes wars? Well, the Enlightenment twins, Freud, but especially Marx, felt that it somehow was due to real oppression. And today I think most people think it's due to poverty. So after 9/11, I don't know if you remember what a lot of our elite said. It was, what do we do to deserve this? Why do we oppress people? But then people ask themselves, people in Central America weren't doing this. I live in an area where people were coming from Oaxaca, Mexico, Misotex, India, and some of the poorest people in the world. They would never do this. In fact, if you look at the profile of the terrorist, it wasn't the people from the slums of Cairo. It was people who were, in fact, quite wealthy. Bin Laden, Mohammed Atta, that had some education. In fact, it was almost as if the more they knew about the West and had lived in the West, all of the hijackers lived in Europe. It was almost as if the West spurred their appetites faster than Islam could repress it. So I don't think that we can just say that poverty causes war. The ancient Greeks said most wars were fought over land, borders between city-states. But the funny thing is, if you look at that land, it was very poor. Neither side really needed it. It was a matter of prestige. And the fact is that wars are just as likely fought over perceived grievances. And in the classical sense, if you go to the text of Thucydides, he says in 2 places in the text that states fight for time, honor. They fight out of fear, deos. They fight for self-interest, ophilia. In other words, their perceptions. Hitler wasn't starving. He didn't have an absence of room. There was more open spaces in Germany in 1933, 1934 than there is now. But it was a perception that it was wronged. So most states go to war because of their perceived grievances. Saddam Hussein had enough oil. He attacked Kuwait because he felt that the 13th province would add to his honor, or he was afraid of westernization and being cornered, or he thought it was in his self-interest to jack up the price of oil. Bin Laden, if we take him at what he said, and not what we said he said that he hated the West because its culture was crowding out Islam. He was afraid of it. He had honor, in other words, and he had the self-interest. He said he wanted a caliphate all the way across North Africa into the Fertile Crescent, almost as if it was a 14th century caliphate. But that's very hard for Westerners to accept, that people will go to war and kill people because of their perceptions rather than their real material need. Is war always evil? It should be, because as Herodotus says, it's an abnormal condition when fathers unfortunately bury sons rather than sons' fathers. But sometimes not a lot of people get killed in war. I'm told that during the first Gulf War, during the 6-month period of U.S. troops being stationed in the desert and then the actual air campaign in the 4-day war, fewer people in the U.S. military got killed in that period than otherwise would have occurred. People have suggested there was less alcohol, less traffic accidents. The Falklands War was not deadly. Sometimes they can be like the Battle of the Somme, in contrast, where 20,000 people are killed within 2 hours. So war itself can be deadly or not deadly, depending on the circumstances in which it's waged. Does it have a utility? Well, people say, not in my name, don't go to war, but how did we get rid of chattel slavery? Proud people, like the Confederacy, they would have, I'm told that they were going to outlaw slavery by 1920. I was told that not long ago. But I don't think that would be the truth. War did that. How did fascism, Japanese militarism, Nazism, they all disappeared out of war. So whether we like it or not, there's a utility to war. Is preemption bad? Unilateralism bad? These are all words that we're hearing now that are divorced from the moral landscape. Preemption is good only if it's successful and it's for a moral cause. I think it was pretty good to preempt Mr. Milosevic. None of our European allies complained then because it was successful and he was a mass murderer. Had we attacked France and been successful, everybody would have denounced us. Had we attacked Milosevic and failed, everybody would have denounced us. So the coupling of success and morality tends to make preemption good. So we'll be praised if we go into Iraq and we can make the moral case that this man's a fascist who's a mass murderer, wants to kill us all, and we get rid of him. If we can't make that case, or if we can make that case and lose, then the world will turn on us. That's a sad story, I think, of war throughout the ages. If we know the long-term causes of war, why do they have to break out? Just because states have these perceived grievances, there's no reason. Can't we mediate? Why did World War I? Why did World War II? Why did the Gulf War break out? Well, if we were going to go back to ask the Greeks, they would say because one side thought they could get away with it. And because of their honor or their fear or their prestige or the self-interest, they thought that it was less dangerous to take something than to get caught at it. If you were to take a classical idea of deterrence, again, this seems very reductionist to us, but they would have said, starting in 1980 with the hostages in Iran, the barracks in Lebanon, progressing on to the embassy attacks in Africa, the First World Trade Center, the Khobar Towers, murdering of Americans, the USS Cole, you name it. In each case, there was either no response or there was a cruise missile or maybe a shelling. And so in bin Laden's way of thinking, remember he said that Americans were dragged through the streets. Maybe you hit the World Trade Center, maybe you knock off the top of it, who knows, but go back into your cave, wait for a cruise missile, and then slowly and insidiously you could erode the will of Americans to station themselves in the Middle East. In this way of thinking, of course, Hitler thinks that he can go to war because nobody's going to stop him. Demosthenes tells everybody from 358 to 338 that this man, Philip, wants to kill us all and he wants to enslave us. And Philip gets away with it because he's appeased. I know that people say that the Roman Vegetus said, if you want to have peace, prepare for war, but he wasn't the first to say it. Actually, it was an obscure Athenian Boeotian general, man from Thebes on the border of Athens, who in 424, his name was Pagondas, he says, we live next to the Athenians, and you're always going to be at war with them unless you're prepared to go to war and beat them. And so in 424, he talked his army into taking a preemptive strike against an Athenian army that was already on the other side of the border and defeated them, and they never came back. So whether we like it, there's an argument that deterrence is actually, in some cases, the more moral path. And remember that preemption will never earn you the crown of morality because you, by definition, admit that somebody is going to have to be sacrificed. Whereas if you appease people, there's always the hope that everybody can be saved. And notice that when we went into Serbia, we were condemned by the Europeans for not helping them. We were told that 250,000 Kosovars and Bosnians had been killed. We went in, 57 days later, the problem, whether it was sloppy or not, is under debate. The problem was solved. Did people thank the United States for being preemptory? No. They said that we had hit too many civilians. That's the price that you pay for preemption. Whereas appeasement can always be justified by the fact that you didn't have a bloodlust. You wanted to save lives. Okay, so wars start for these perceived grievances, and they break out when one side thinks they can get away with it. Who wins and who loses? Well, we can't come up with some grand deterministic theory through 2,500 years of civilization. Let me just offer, though, there is a tendency that warring parties that are more Western, that is, they follow precepts that were started in classical Greece and Rome, that is, they define discipline by group advance, by volley fire, by chain of command, by staying in line, staying in rank, drilling, people who have an element of individual freedom in their society, people who are secular. They don't have a mullah determining which weapons program they should buy. People who have a consensual government, middle class, an open and free market that can supply logistics, they tend to have the edge. So if we look throughout history, more Greeks were killed in the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta within the first 3 years than all of the Greeks that were killed in the Persian Wars, even though the forces were vast. Alexander the Great killed more Greeks than the Persians did. Greek mercenaries under hire for Darius III. More people were killed in the Roman Civil War, 250,000, than the entire 400-year conquest of the empire. If we look at our own history, well, the British Empire lost less than 100 putting down the Great Mahdi, but just a few years later, they lost 2,000 in a week against the Boers. Mr. Cortez went down, and whatever you think of him, he took 500 Spaniards in his initial assault and later beefed it up to 1,500 and probably lost about 700 men and destroyed an empire that was vast, that had a subject population of 4 million. So whether you like it or not, when there's a consensual Western society, and to the degree that one side is Western, whether it's the British going into the Falklands, or the United States going into Bosnia, or Israel surrounded by a chain of enemies, they bring advantages to the battlefield. Doesn't mean they're always going to win, especially in today's world where we see armies that are westernizing: China, Russia, Iraq. And this is going to be the great question that you're going to have to deal with. Can an Iraq or a China assume half the cargo of the West, its technology and weaponry, without its freedom and its chain of command and its consensual government and its civic militias, with the idea that all of you have rights and responsibilities as citizens? It is kind of ironic that you as professional soldiers have more freedom and more rights than a draftee in Korea or China, even though they claim that they're keep upholding the tradition of civic militarism. So who wins wars? Well, usually sides that are more Western than the other have advantages. What brings wars to close? I was thinking this the other day when President Bush said that we had an axis of evil. You remember the axis of evil? There was 3: Iraq, Iran, North Korea. He didn't say the axis of evil is Germany, Japan, and Vietnam. Yet we've all been at war with them. But it seems to me that the reason that we have an axis of evil, whether it's the embassy bombing or the Gulf War with Iraq or the tragic 1950 to 1953 conflict with Korea, those were not settled. There was not an abject winner or loser. Israel has 5 wars, if you count Lebanon, and it has not been able to militarily defeat and humiliate the enemy, because each time it does, because of fears of a global exchange during the Cold War, it was stopped. Germany went to war in World War II, but if you look at the literature between 1918 and 1932, the German army believed it was never defeated. And it had some credence. It said, we surrendered in France. We did not surrender in Germany. And when Mr. Pershing said we have to go into Germany, occupy it, humiliate that army, and tell them they were beaten, or we'll have a war, he was right. Because as soon as the Americans and the Allies withdrew, then the mythology of the stab in the back, the Jews, the Marxists, the bankers, but not us in the army. We were never defeated, and we had World War II. And notice in World War II, at its conclusion, the United States didn't make that mistake again. So for better or for worse, Germany either is not or cannot be an enemy of ours right away. So it turns out, whether we like it or not, usually defeat brings a close to wars. And if you don't have defeat, you'll have a war pretty soon, or victory. There was First and Second Punic War. There was a third. There was no Fourth Punic War, because at that point the Romans decided to destroy Carthage. There was a First and Second Peloponnesian War, but once the Spartans sailed in and defeated the Athenians, it lost that war. And that's what I think brings peace, for good or for evil. I think that's a lesson that we don't like to hear at all, that these are how wars are concluded, by the victory or the defeat of one of the combatants. If all this is sort of self-evident to us, at least if we could get a Greek to come in here, a philosopher such as Heraclitus or Plato, and he would tell us this, why is it so disturbing to our elite in this country? Why are intellectuals so ambivalent? Why do, when you pick up the paper, why would a Jessica Lange said that she's humiliated and ashamed to be an American? Or why did a Norman Mailer say when the Twin Towers fell, it were like two buck teeth that were pulled, and that the ruins were more beautiful than the original building? Why was it that Philip Roth, an American novelist, said that he's usually, quote, bored by New York, but after 9/11 I found it once again interesting, and I was able to visit because of the disaster? What is it among us that does not, that bristles at this classical pessimism about the humankind, and that people who profess humanity and who profess kindness can get everybody killed if they don't understand the nature of war? What is it about our society that encourages this elite disdain for the very institutions that sometimes enrich people? That's a question that great books and philosophers have wrestled with. But let me just say that it seems to me that we have to realize that we are living in the most affluent, privileged period of civilization in the last 2,500 years. Never in civilization have so many millions of Americans and Europeans had a degree of material splendor, affluence, and leisure. What was once confined to the imperial family in Rome or the French court at Versailles is now shared by hundreds of thousands of elite Americans, millions of them. And for most, that's brought appreciation, but not for all. Because if we were to ask the great triad of Roman, brilliant Roman writers of the imperial period, here I'm thinking of Petronius, Suetonius, and Juvenal, they would say that with luxus comes license, and that certain people, when they're given an opportunity, whether it's through tenure, lifelong employment, 9 months a year teaching, or whether it's through the arts or through government, where you really cannot be fired, either through tenure or through a lawsuit, and you have a permanent employee, you have a permanent employment. What is it then about that circumstance that affects certain people? And I think the answer is that they begin to look at distant things in theory because they no longer have to look at the concrete in fact. If your child is not going to die of tetanus, if you get a kidney stone and you know it's a day's pain, you can have it removed. If you're not going to go out and struggle for your next meal, then you have the leisure and the opportunity to think about perfection. That is, you can think about all these causes. And with a global communication system, you can worry about people in Bosnia. You can worry about what the Iraqi child says, or that he doesn't have milk. That bothers you because, after all, it is sort of guilty to ask yourself, why are you so privileged? So to a lot of Westerners, they want to wrestle with that. And one of the things that comes out of it is guilt for the very circumstances of which they're so lucky to have. But it's a very funny kind of guilt. Maybe you can disagree with me, but so far the people who are so guilty about the planet being polluted and the people on it being oppressed, who I can't tell the difference whether they drive an SUV or not an SUV. All I can see is when I go to university, they have Volvos instead of Cadillacs. And when I go to their homes, they may decry the desecration of the forest, but they still have oak floors, pine floors, redwood decks. It's very hard to disconnect from the teat of Western culture that you so despise. So it creates this very funny kind of a hypocrisy that we see in our novelists, our artisans, our professors. There's another element as well, and that is I noticed with a lot of people, especially in the crisis since 9/11, besides guilt, there's an envy. Because after all, if you are educated and you're well off, then and you're subtle, then you begin to think, why am I not appreciated? Because why is Cheney, why does Bush, why does the corporate elite make more money than I do? After all, I'm more subtle. I say nuclear, I don't say nuclear. I know how to parse my verbs, unlike the president. I just saw the Spanish ambassador was on television, and he said, axis of evil. Now remember, Spanish ambassador, this is a man whose country almost went to war over an uninhabited rock off the northern coast. He said, axis of evil, how banal, he said. So there's this idea that if you're a member of this affluent class, you not only have guilt, you have envy of people who in the corporate world have more than you. It's very disappointing to be a professor of Renaissance literature, and yet the president of your university would rather take out to dinner the owner of the local Taco Bell franchise, because he's going to give more money to the university than you are. And in our plutocratic society, capital is more important than credentials or money or, education. So there's this element of envy. And then thirdly, why do people seem to have this war so wrong among our elite? I think there's also this burdens of egalitarianism. Marxism is dead, but the fumes of it, whether it's multiculturalism, cultural relativism, moral equivalence, they still have the theme of imposing radical equality on anybody and everybody. An opportunity, not a equality of opportunity, but a situation where that you have an equality of results. Now, what does that mean? That puts a terrible burden on an elite person, because we don't live anymore in a society where you can be a duke or an earl or a marquis. So the whole nomenclature of privilege is gone. I noticed that if you're a Marxist professor, you can still say you're the Brandenburg Professor of, your endowed chair title, which usually came through the bequest of some capitalist. Or you can be Martina Navratilova, who said she was sick of America and it oppressed her, even though she's a multimillionaire after she fled to the United States. But nevertheless, there's a burden of equality. So how do you find status? Every person wants status commensurate with their achievement. But once you have gone down this road of being an elite egalitarian and you suffer from envy and you suffer from hypocrisy, it's very hard to manifest yourself. One of the ways you do it is you fawn over the Europeans. Forget the fact that they have an EU that's increasingly anti-democratic, but you contrast it favorably with the United States. Forget the fact that judges have far more dictatorial powers in Europe than they do in the United States, but you praise their judicial system. Forget the fact that for 7 years, 250,000 people were butchered 3 hours in Berlin, but attacked the United States. Or as Edward Said said, what's this clash of civilization? Don't you know that there's an opera in Cairo? Now, there hasn't ever been a free election in Cairo, but in the elite mind, the fact that you know opera and you can talk about opera, it somehow allows you to distinguish yourself. So there's a part of this war criticism that we're seeing is an effort to be cynical, nihilistic, hypercritical, sarcastic, as the only mechanism today's intellectual has to separate himself. So when Susan Sontag said we had it coming, literary critic in Australia said how neat that she divorced herself from the mob. There's a very deep-seated disdain for the average American because their culture, whether you like it or not, is sweeping the globe. And this culture is not an elite culture. Spider-Man, PlayStation 2, Walmart, whether you like it or not, this is the only revolutionary society in the history of civilization. The verdict's out on its morality, but nevertheless, it's a society where the average person has grasped control of the cultural engine and determines what people like on TV or their movies or how they eat. And that's very disturbing to a lot of very elite people. That's another reason that we have this problem. And finally, I'd like to end by the age-old pride of the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment, remember, in the 18th century, the Second Enlightenment, there was one in 5th century Greece, was the hope of mankind, because it said that no longer are we going to explain natural phenomenon according to superstition, but we're going to employ logic and reason. So anything we can't grasp or can't understand, we're going to say, we can figure it out. If you have a plague in 5th century Athens, then it's not because Zeus doesn't like you. It's not because you have an internal demon in you. You look for symptoms, and then you can come up with a diagnosis, and then you have a prognosis. That scientific method, which reemerged in the 18th century, is with us today. But the problem with the Enlightenment has always been that if you don't allow some measure, some small sphere for faith, then you're hopelessly wedded to continual hyper and increased expectations of human perfection. Now, we can all know that if we get cancer, something's going to happen, but we haven't yet figured out why I'm going to get cancer or you're going to get cancer and not him. We can't figure out why, if anybody gets in a wreck on the way home, why it was us. We can say the car was at fault, it was raining, but we can't yet play God. So there has to be some element that's inexplicable, and it requires exegesis through faith. But to the child of the Enlightenment, we're going to be judged because they don't believe we have a soul. We're not going to be judged in the hereafter. We're going to be judged right now, instantaneously, collectively, by our good works. That is, the good works to the degree that they follow the precepts of the Enlightenment. You can kill 600,000 Americans in the Civil War to stop slavery in a minority of states. And to the enlightened mind, that is still a sin that reflects intrinsic weaknesses in the Constitution. We can go into the worst country in the Middle East, the Taliban, who practiced an odious gender apartheid, homophobia, destroyed cultural icons, murdered, tortured. In less than 6 weeks, we can dismantle it, and we can set up the institutions of a constitutional government. And if it's not like a New England countryside and a New England village, then we consider ourselves failures because we haven't pulled that off within a year. That is the arrogance and the increasing demands that the Enlightenment puts upon all of us, that we always must, as affluent Westerners, not only feel guilty about it, not only try to find status when it's hypocritical to do so, not always hector somebody in the abstract rather than looking at problems right in the concrete, but we also suffer from this idea of utopian, I guess we would call it utopian perfection. Let me sum up then. What does all this mean in our present conflict? Well, it seems to me that there's a empirical record of the way states wage war with one another. And it's not pretty. Young people, more or less, are asked to die, and states usually are not war isn't usually just a misunderstanding of two nice people. It may be 52% good and 48% bad, but there's usually an onus of responsibility on one state. This not modern Enlightenment idea that there's nobody at fault, sort of like zero tolerance when you went to high school. Some big kid walks over and hits you over the head 5 days in a row, and one time you hit back, and then you're both kicked out of school because the administrator wants to wash his hand from the moral responsibility of investigating who was at fault. We call that moral equivalence, and we saw it in this recent war where deliberately trying to butcher civilians in a time of peace in New York was equivalent of deliberately trying to avoid civilians in a time of war in Afghanistan. So it seems to me that in the present war, we've got to go back to classical precepts about how states make war. And it's, as I said, it's not pretty because it suggests that there is evil in the world and that evil will progress because of its infatuation with its sense of honor or its self-interest or its own fears. And we don't have to necessarily find material or economic exploitation. And one side's going to fight the other. hopefully the side that has a commitment to constitutional government, and the Western tradition will have advantages. And then the war will be over when one side wins and one side loses, and the problem will be solved. That's what it is. And that is very distasteful for a small group of very influential people in this country who, by nature of the very affluent society in which they live, the hypocrisy which it creates, the sense of radical egalitarianism, which is impossible to maintain given their circumstances, the sense of envy toward capitalist and richer people, and finally their own arrogance that's a byproduct of the Enlightenment, will skew all of this up. And I think in some cases we're in a mess about that. Let me just finish with a minute or two, and we'll ask some questions if you like. What does this mean? Is it important that we go back to a classical sense of what wars are? I think it is, for a couple of reasons. It's very popular in the press and in journal articles, if you read them, to say that we're like a grasping Rome now. We're an imperial power. Funny imperial power whose proconsuls go out and try to rent a base from somebody to protect them. You go to Greece and pay them $400 million rather than just take it and make them pay for it the way that Rome did. Funny empire that hasn't annexed land since 1898. But nevertheless, if you want to use that parallel, remember that in 200 BC, Rome had far more formidable enemies than it did in 400 AD. I would rather fight any day some Germans across the borders or some Vandals or Visigoths than the Carthaginian Empire. At the same time, you were fighting the Macedonian Empire in Greece under Philip V. At the same time, you were dealing with Spanish tribes, German tribes, and French. But the difference over that 600-year period, in 200 BC, Romans knew what it was to be a Roman, and they had a feeling that it was a little bit better than the alternative. And so they fought. In 400 AD, they neither knew what it was anymore to be a Roman, they were not at all sure if it was any better or worse, and so they deservedly disappeared. And it seems to me the danger of all this is that we're trying to create a sense that is akin to Rome, because when Americans feel that they cannot define what America is, and they don't believe that it's any better or worse than any other alternate paradigm, then they deserve to disappear, and they will. And so I'll leave you with the idea that when you see people who talk like this, and there's a lot of them in the present war, I'm not talking about honest critics that have legitimate grievances about strategy and tactics and politics. I'm talking about people who are enraged at the United States without empirical reason. When you see such people, I think it's wise to say that hatred reveals more of your malady than it does us. It's a reaction to something that you have. You have the problem, not the United States. Thank you.